The wind swept across the barren land, carrying with it the scent of dust, dry grass, and distant smoke. The sun hung low, heavy and unforgiving, turning the plains into a sheet of gold and fire. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote cried out, and the sound faded into the endless silence that only the desert could hold. It was the kind of silence that made a person feel both alive and lost. In that lonely stretch of land, a woman rode slowly, her horse's hooves stirring small clouds of dust with each tired step. She sat straight despite the weight of her swollen belly pressing against her ribs. Her face was pale under the brim of her hat, her lips cracked, her eyes sharp with exhaustion but burning with purpose. She had been on the trail for 2 days, ever since the storm tore through her homestead and took what little she had left. Her husband had been gone for months, buried somewhere beyond the ridge after a fever took him. The small cabin they built together now stood empty, except for the smell of smoke and the memories she couldn't shake.
All the people
in town called her a widow too young to survive alone. They pitied her, whispered about her belly, about how she still worked the land herself, and about how she spoke to no one. She didn't care much about their whispers. She had learned that pity was heavier than loneliness. All she cared for now was getting to the river before nightfall, where she could rest and maybe find some clean water. But the land had other plans. As she rode through the canyon, the sound of something strange caught her ear, a faint cry, weak and rough, like a wounded animal. She stopped and listened. The cry came again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. It was a man's voice, hoarse with pain. Her heart quickened. Trouble in these parts often meant death, and she had no weapon but the small revolver tucked under her coat. She hesitated, looking around the canyon walls that loomed like red scars under the dying sun. Then she heard it again, a broken moan, followed by the sharp clang of metal against wood. Against her better sense, she turned her horse toward the sound. The trail narrowed between 2 cliffs, and at the edge of a dry creek she saw him. A man was tied to a tree, his wrists bound tight with rawhide. His chest was bare, marked with cuts and bruises that looked days old. His dark hair clung to his face, matted with dust and blood. An Apache, her breath caught. She had heard stories of them since childhood, fierce warriors, proud and unyielding, known to raid settlements when the army pushed too close to their lands. But this man didn't look like the danger the old folks spoke of. He looked beaten, starved, and left for dead. She sat there on her horse, torn between fear and compassion. The army scouts sometimes passed through here, and they didn't take kindly to settlers helping the tribes. She had seen what happened to those accused of aiding them, the burned barns, the hangings. Still, something in her heart stirred as she looked at him. He was breathing, barely, and the ropes had cut deep into his wrists. The man lifted his head weakly, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark and steady, though dulled by pain. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind rustled the branches above them, and a hawk circled in the distance. She dismounted slowly, her boots sinking into the soft sand. Every step she took toward him made her pulse louder in her ears. When she reached him, she saw the extent of his wounds. His shoulder was slashed open, his ribs bruised, and a long cut stretched across his back. Whoever had done this hadn't meant to kill him quickly. They wanted him to suffer. She reached for her knife, the small one she kept for cutting rope or cloth. As she brought it near his wrists, he tensed, his breath shallow and uncertain. "Easy," she whispered. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the gravity of what she was about to do. "I'm not here to hurt you." The knife slipped between the rawhide, and with a few quick strokes, the ropes gave way. He slumped forward, catching himself weakly before falling to the ground. She knelt beside him, supporting his shoulders. His skin was hot with fever, and he whispered something in a language she didn't understand. It sounded like a prayer. She looked around, scanning the horizon. The canyon was still, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way. Whoever had left him here could return. The thought made her stomach twist. Helping him could cost her everything, her safety, her home, her unborn child. But leaving him there to die felt worse. "I'll get you water," she said quietly, moving to her saddlebag. She filled a tin cup and brought it back, pressing it gently to his lips. He drank in small, careful sips, his eyes never leaving hers. When he was done, he spoke again, his voice faint, but steady enough to form English words. "You should not be here. I could say the same to you, she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. What happened? He looked away, as if searching for words. Betrayed, he said finally, by my own. They gave me to the soldiers. The words hit her like a cold wind. The army had been nearby a few days ago, moving east toward the reservation line. If they were the ones who did this, she was in even greater danger than she thought. The soldiers wouldn't question a woman's loyalty. They'd assume she was helping the enemy. She helped him sit up, though he winced with every movement. Can you walk? He shook his head slowly. It's not far. She looked at the fading sky. Night was close. She couldn't leave him here. But she also couldn't risk being caught. Every instinct screamed at her to get back on her horse and ride away before it was too late. Yet when she looked at him again, weak but unbroken, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was because she knew what it felt like to be alone in a cruel world, to be left behind when life stripped you bare. Without another word, she went to her horse and pulled out a blanket. We have to move, she said. There's a small cabin near the ridge. It's not much, but it'll keep you alive until morning. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, as if he couldn't understand why she would risk so much for a stranger. She didn't understand it either. But as she helped him onto the horse, she felt a strange strength rising in her, stronger than fear, stronger than reason. They rode slowly through the canyon, the wind whispering through the rocks like a warning. The moon was rising now, pale and watchful. She kept her hand on the reins and her eyes on the trail, listening for the faintest sound that might mean pursuit. Behind her, the man's breathing was shallow but steady. When they reached the ridge, she stopped. From there, she could see the outline of her cabin in the valley below, the chimney standing like a lonely marker against the night sky. For a moment, she thought she saw movement near its shadows shifting, a glimmer of light. Her heart pounded. Someone was there. She froze, gripping the reins tighter. If it was the soldiers, they might have tracked the Apache's trail. If it was bandits, they could have followed her scent. Either way, going back could mean death. She looked at the man slumped behind her, half-conscious, and then at the small flicker of firelight in the distance. The night air turned colder as her mind raced. She had risked everything by cutting him free, but now she would have to risk even more to keep them both alive. The wind carried the faint sound of horses from far below. She turned her head slowly, eyes narrowing at the ridge behind them. Torches. Someone was coming. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she whispered to herself, "Lord, help me. What have I done?" The night swallowed her words as the sound of hooves drew closer, and, echoing off the canyon walls like a storm about to break, the sound of hooves grew louder, each beat echoing off the canyon walls and rolling across the open land like thunder. She pulled her horse to the side of the ridge, her breath uneven, her eyes darting between the faint lights below and the shadowed path behind. The Apache slumped against her back, too weak to speak, but aware enough to lift his head and glance toward the approaching glow. She could feel the tension in him, the quiet readiness of someone who had lived his whole life on the edge of danger. She guided the horse down a narrow path that led away from the main trail, hoping the darkness and uneven rocks would hide them. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of burning wood and gunpowder. Her chest tightened. If those men were from the army, they were close enough to track smoke, footprints, or even the faint print of a horse's hoof. She had no choice but to move quietly and quickly. The trail bent along the ridge and dipped into a shallow ravine where the moonlight barely touched the ground. She stopped there, listening again. The hooves were closer now, 3, maybe 4 riders. Their voices carried faintly through the night, muffled by the wind but sharp enough that she could make out the tone of command. Men used to being obeyed. Soldiers. She slid off her horse and pressed her hand against the animal's neck to calm it. The Apache stirred slightly, his breath ragged. She leaned close and whispered, "We can't go back to the cabin. Too dangerous. We'll wait here until they pass." He nodded faintly, his eyes half closed, trusting her even though he had no reason to. They crouched behind a cluster of rocks. She held her revolver close, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The flickering glow of torches appeared above the ridgeline. The riders' voices grew clearer now. "Search the valley," one of them ordered. "The half-blood's got to be nearby. The tracks end at the creek." Another man laughed coldly. "If he's not dead yet, he will be soon. Let the coyotes finish the job." Her stomach turned. So it was truth they were hunting him, If they found her hiding here, they would assume she was helping him. The punishment for that wasn't something she could bear to think about. The horses moved past, their shadows long and crooked in the moonlight. One of the soldiers paused, glancing toward the ravine as if he sensed something. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't see them. The moment stretched endlessly, the night holding its breath with her. Then the man turned his horse and followed the others down the trail. Only when their voices faded into the distance did she dare to move. She turned to the Apache, who was watching her silently. His gaze was sharp again, as if the brush with death had cleared some of his exhaustion. "They're looking for you," she said softly. "I know," he answered. His voice was low, deep, and calm. "They think I took something from them." She frowned. "Did you?" His lips curved slightly, not in a smile, but something like bitterness. "Truth. That's what I took. I saw what they did. They didn't want me to live to tell it." She studied him for a moment. There was something in his tone that made her believe him. He didn't sound like a man hiding guilt. He sounded like someone who had seen too much. "What did they do?" she asked. He hesitated, then looked away toward the dark horizon. "They killed a family near the border. Said it was Apache raiders, but it wasn't. It was the soldiers themselves. I saw them burn the cabin, take what they wanted. When I spoke against them, they tied me to that tree." She felt a chill crawl up her spine. She knew the kind of men who led those patrols, rough, greedy, and too quick to blame others. Still, hearing it said out loud made the world feel darker than before. "Then you really can't be found," she said, glancing back at the ridge. "They'll kill you if they catch you." He nodded slowly. "They'll kill you too if they think you helped me." She looked down at her belly, the faint ache reminding her of the life growing inside. "I know," she whispered. They stayed in the ravine until the night deepened and the sounds of the riders faded completely. The cold began to bite at her fingers and the Apache's breathing grew shallower. She couldn't keep him there much longer. The risk of being found was still there, but if she didn't get him shelter soon, he would die anyway. "There's an old miner's shack not far from here," she said finally. "It's half fallen, but it'll do till morning." He didn't protest, just nodded, and she helped him back onto the horse. The ride was slow, every step echoing in the quiet night. The land stretched endlessly ahead of them, dark hills, thorny brush, and the faint shimmer of the river far in the distance. When they reached the shack, it was just as she remembered, a small, leaning structure tucked between rocks, its roof patched with rusted tin. She helped him inside and laid him on an old blanket that smelled of dust and cedar. He winced as he lay back, the pain etched into his face. She lit a small lantern and knelt beside him. "You need rest," she said. He looked at her for a long moment before replying. "Why do you help me?" She hesitated. "Because someone should," she said quietly. "Because too many people look away when they should stand up." He studied her face, as if trying to read the truth behind her words. "You've lost someone," he said softly. She nodded. "My husband. Fever took him last winter. And the child?" he asked gently. She placed a hand over her belly. "He's all I have left of him." For a while neither spoke. The wind outside rattled the broken boards of the shack, and the firelight flickered across their faces. There was a strange peace in that silence, even with danger still close by. But peace never lasted long in that country. The horse outside snorted suddenly, its ears twitching toward the darkness. She froze, then reached for her revolver. The Apache's hand went to the knife she had used to free him. A distant whistle broke the silence, low, deliberate, the kind used by scouts to signal one another. Her heart skipped. "They found us," she whispered. He pushed himself up, grimacing at the pain. "I can't stay here." She helped him to his feet, but he was still weak. "You can't fight them like this," she said. "I've fought worse," he answered, his voice steady despite the tremor in it. He moved toward the door, peering through a crack in the wood. Faint orange glow flickered in the distant torches again. They were coming down the trail, maybe a mile off. "Go," he said suddenly. "Take your horse and ride. They find you here, they'll kill you and the child." She shook her head. "I won't leave you." "You must," he insisted. "I am the reason they hunt this way." Her eyes burned with frustration. "You think I'd save you just to let them finish the job?" He looked at her, and for the first time, a small flicker of emotion crossed his face, something like respect, maybe even sorrow. "You're braver than most," he said quietly. "But bravery can't stop bullets." She stepped closer, meeting his gaze. Neither can running if you're alone. He didn't answer. The torches were closer now. The sound of hooves reached their ears again, the rhythm slow and steady. She blew out the lantern, plunging the shack into darkness. "We'll find a way out," she whispered. "There's a dry gully behind the ridge. It leads to the river. If we can reach the water, their tracks will fade." He nodded once, and together they slipped into the night. The air was cold, sharp against their faces. The moon was sinking behind the hills, leaving the land cloaked in half-shadow. Every step they took was careful, every sound measured. The Apache moved with quiet grace, even in his wounded state, guiding her through the rocks and brush like a shadow. She followed, her hand resting lightly on her belly, her other gripping the revolver tight. Behind them, the torches flared brighter. A man shouted. Another replied. "You found the horse," she whispered. The Apache turned, his eyes narrowing. "Keep moving. Don't look back." She did as he said, though her heart raced faster with each step. The land around them seemed endless, but the river was close. She could hear the faint rush of water now. Hope flickered inside her, thin but alive. Then came the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet struck the rock near her foot, sending shards flying. She stumbled, gasping. The Apache caught her arm, steadying her. "They've seen us," he said grimly. They ran then, as fast as the uneven ground allowed. The sound of hooves thundered closer, torches flashing like angry fireflies against the dark. She could hear the men shouting now, their words carried by the wind. She clutched the revolver, turning once to fire blindly toward the noise. The shot echoed, startling the horses behind them. Bought them only a few seconds, but it was enough. The river came into view, silver and wild under the moonlight. She could almost taste the cold air rising from it. The Apache gripped her hand tightly, guiding her down the slope. Behind them, the riders closed in. The ground trembled under the weight of their charge. As they reached the edge of the river bank, she turned to him, her chest heaving. "What now?" He looked at the rushing water, then at her. His face was pale but determined. "Now we trust the river," he said. Before she could question him, the first torchlight appeared at the top of the ridge, casting long shadows across the bank. She took one last breath of dry desert air, the weight of her unborn child heavy inside her, and followed him toward the dark water that promised either freedom or death. The cold hit her like a slap when she stepped into the river. The current was stronger than she expected, rushing around her legs, pulling at her clothes as if trying to drag her away. The Apache gripped her hand tightly, his face tense with pain but steady. The moonlight shimmered across the surface, and the roar of the water drowned out the shouts behind them. The riders had reached the ridge, their torches flaring against the darkness like angry stars. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the river's noise. She nodded, her teeth chattering as they waded deeper. The water rose to her waist, then to her chest. The chill sank into her bones, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind them came another gunshot, the sound slicing through the wind. A bullet splashed into the water near her shoulder. They moved with the current, letting it carry them downstream. The Apache half swam, half floated, one arm around her waist, the other pushing through the water. She could feel his strength fading with every stroke, but he didn't let go. The current dragged them around a bend where the canyon walls rose high and narrow, hiding them from view. When they finally reached a patch of shallow water, they stumbled toward the bank, gasping for breath. She collapsed on the muddy shore, her dress soaked and heavy. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she pushed her wet hair from her face. The Apache dropped beside her, coughing, blood running from a reopened wound on his shoulder. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were the wind and the steady rush of the river behind them. Finally, she turned to him. "You're bleeding again." He glanced at his shoulder and nodded faintly. "It will stop. Can't stay here." He was right. Soldiers would follow the river once they realized what direction they had gone. They needed shelter, warmth, and time. But the wilderness stretched endlessly around them. No town, no house, not even a campfire in sight. She helped him stand, though her legs shook from exhaustion. "There's a line of caves at Priver," he said, his voice weakening. "My people used them long ago when the army came. We can rest there." They moved slowly, following a narrow deer trail through the underbrush. The moon disappeared behind clouds, plunging the world into darkness. Every step felt uncertain. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than the wind, and every rustle of leaves made her flinch. After what felt like hours, they reached the caves, a cluster of shadowy openings hidden beneath an overhang of rock. She led the horse inside the widest one, tethering it to a stone pillar, and helped the Apache sit against the wall. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. She built a small fire with the few dry twigs she could find, shielding the smoke with a blanket to keep it from rising too high. The light flickered across the walls, revealing faint markings, old drawings, symbols she couldn't understand. She looked at them quietly. "My ancestors," he murmured. "They came here long before the settlers." She nodded, feeling a strange weight in the air. "Do they still live nearby?" He shook his head. "Most were forced north. Some stayed, hiding in the hills. The army doesn't look for them anymore. I think the land took them." She sat beside the fire, rubbing her hands for warmth. "And were you born here?" He hesitated before answering. "Yes, my mother was Apache. My father was a trader. Neither side accepted me. The soldiers used me as a guide because I spoke both tongues. I thought I could make peace between them. I was wrong." His voice carried no anger, only tiredness, the kind that comes from years of trying to be something for everyone and belonging nowhere. She understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. They sat in silence for a while, the firelight dancing over their faces. The baby inside her kicked gently, as if reminding her of its presence. She pressed a hand to her belly, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. She had planned to live quietly after her husband's death, away from the noise of war and greed. And here she was, caught in someone else's battle, hunted in the middle of nowhere. The Apache noticed her distant look. "You should rest," he said softly. "You've done more than I deserved." "You're wrong," she replied. "No one deserves what they did to you." He met her gaze, his eyes dark and thoughtful. "Kindness is dangerous out here. It makes people weak." "I don't believe that," she said firmly. "Kindness is the only thing that still makes us human." He said nothing after that, but the look in his eyes softened. She turned back to the fire, watching the sparks rise and fade. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, carrying faint echoes. She stiffened, listening. It was hard to tell if it was the sound of the storm or voices on the wind. She prayed it was the storm. The night passed slowly. She didn't sleep, though she closed her eyes and tried. When the first pale light of dawn crept into the cave, she rose and went to the entrance. The land was quiet again, washed in silver mist. No torches, no horses. For now, they were safe, but she knew it wouldn't last. The Apache stirred awake, his face drawn with fatigue. She brought him water and tore a piece of cloth from her skirt to clean his wound. He didn't flinch, just watched her silently. "You could have left me," he said after a while. "Most would have." "I've buried too many," she said quietly. "I won't bury another if I can help it." His eyes flicked to her belly, then back to her face. "Your husband was a good man," she nodded. "He worked hard, cared for the land, never took more than he needed. But the sickness came one winter, and nothing I did could stop it." Her voice wavered, and she looked away. "After he died, the world felt colder. The people in town stopped visiting. I think they were afraid of catching my grief." He looked at her for a long moment. "Grief can be worse than hunger. It eats you from inside." She nodded. "That's why I keep moving. It's the only way I know to survive." A silence settled between them again, not heavy this time, just understanding. Then the sound of distant horses broke it. She froze. The Apache's head lifted sharply. "They're coming back," he said. "How do you know it's them?" "The rhythm," he replied, his tone certain. "Army horses. It's not wild." Her heart pounded as she doused the fire with dirt. The smoke hissed and vanished. "We can't go far," she whispered. "You're not strong enough." He pointed toward the rear of the cave. "There's a passage behind the rocks. It leads to the ridge. My people used it to escape." She helped him stand, supporting his weight as they made their way into the dark passage. The air was cool and tight, the ground uneven. They moved slowly, guided by the faint light seeping through cracks in the stone. After what felt like forever, they emerged onto a narrow ledge high above the valley. From there, they could see the riders, 5 of them, moving in formation, scanning the ground near the river. The leader carried a long rifle, his uniform dusty but distinct. "That one," the Apache said quietly. "He's the one who ordered it. Burned the cabin. Gave them my name." She stared at the man, her stomach twisting. He looks like a captain. He was. Until the killing. Now he hides it under orders. He'll destroy anyone who knows. They crouched low, watching as the soldiers dismounted and searched the bank. The captain barked orders, pointing toward the river. Two of the men moved upriver, another down. "They'll find the cave," she whispered. "Not if we move first," he replied. He led her along the ridge, each step careful to avoid loose stones. The path wound between jagged rocks and thorny brush until it opened onto a plateau. From there, they could see miles of desert stretching into the horizon, endless and empty. "We can head east," she said, her breath quick. "Toward the reservation line. They won't follow us that far." He shook his head. "They'll follow until they see bodies. They can't afford witnesses." A sudden gust of wind swept across the plateau, carrying the faint echo of shouting from below. The soldiers had found the cave. "We have to go now," she said, gripping his arm. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the valley. Then his eyes hardened. "They took everything from me," he said quietly. "My name, my tribe, my honor. I won't run forever." She met his gaze, her own filled with fear and defiance. "Then let me stand with you." The sound of gunfire cracked through the distance, sharp and cold. A bullet struck the rocks near them, spraying dust. She turned, eyes wide. The soldiers had spotted them. The Apache grabbed her hand. "Run." They fled across the plateau, the wind howling around them, gunshots echoing behind. The sun was rising now, painting the land in gold and blood. Ahead, the desert stretched vast and unforgiving. Behind, death followed close, its face masked in the uniform of justice. And in that endless space between hope and fear, she realized there was no turning back. The desert stretched endlessly before them, glowing under the cruel sun that climbed higher by the minute. The air shimmered above the sand, and the dry wind carried a sting that burned her face. Each breath came shallow, each step heavier than the last. The Apache moved beside her, limping slightly, his jaw tight against the pain. Behind them, the faint sound of hoofbeats echoed again, steady and relentless. They were being hunted across open land with nowhere to hide. Her legs trembled from exhaustion, her clothes still damp from the river. The horse had bolted when the gunfire started, leaving them with nothing but the revolver, a knife, and their will to survive. She looked over her shoulder once and saw dust rising in the distance. The soldiers were closing in. The Apache stopped for a moment, scanning the land ahead. His eyes narrowed as he pointed toward a cluster of jagged rocks in the distance. "There," he said, "a canyon. If we reach it before they see us, we can lose them among the cliffs." She nodded, though her throat was too dry to speak. They started again, pushing through the heat, their shadows stretching long behind them. Every sound seemed sharper, now the whistle of the wind, the soft crunch of their boots, the faint rhythm of the horses chasing them. By the time they reached the canyon's edge, the sun was sinking toward the horizon. The land fell away into a maze of red stone, deep and twisting. It looked dangerous, but it was the only chance they had left. They climbed down carefully, gripping the rocks for balance. The air grew cooler, but the silence felt heavier, as if the earth itself was listening. Once inside the canyon, the Apache stopped again, crouching low to study the ground. "We'll follow the dry riverbed," he said. "The sand will hide our tracks." They moved quietly, keeping to the shadows. The canyon walls rose high above them, painted in shades of crimson and rust. Small birds fluttered from the cracks, startled by their footsteps. Every now and then, the Apache paused to listen. His senses were sharp despite his wounds, tuned to every echo and whisper of the wind. As night fell, the stars began to appear, faint at first, then bright against the dark sky. She looked up, feeling a strange calm for a brief moment, but it didn't last. The stillness was broken by the distant call of a man's voice, echoing through the canyon. "They've found us," she whispered. The Apache didn't answer. He motioned for her to follow and led her toward a narrow opening in the rock, barely wide enough for one person to pass through. They squeezed inside, their bodies brushing the stone walls. The passage opened into a small hollow, hidden from view. He gestured for her to sit, then crouched near the entrance, watching. For a few moments, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Then came the faint clatter of hooves and boots on stone. The soldiers had entered the canyon. Their voices grew clearer. "Spread out," the captain shouted. "They're close. Check every turn." She pressed her back against the rock, clutching the revolver in both hands. The Apache turned to her, his expression calm but grim. "If they find us," he said quietly, "I'll draw them away. You run east toward the hills." She shook her head fiercely. "No, I won't leave you again. You must," he insisted. "You're carrying life. That matters more than mine." Her throat tightened, but before she could answer, the sound of footsteps came closer. The soldiers were only a few yards away now. Light flickered against the canyon walls as they carried torches, the flames dancing in the wind. She could see their shadows moving long, dark shapes stretching across the sand. One of the men stopped, crouched, and touched the ground. "Tracks," he said. "Fresh." The captain stepped forward, his voice sharp. "They went this way." The Apache reached for his knife, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes met hers for a moment, and something passed between them, understanding, maybe even peace. Then he turned toward the entrance, ready to fight if he had to. She felt the baby move inside her, a small flutter that made her heart ache. Knew if they were caught now, neither of them would survive. She took a deep breath and whispered, "There's another way." He looked at her, puzzled. She pointed toward a narrow crack in the wall behind them. It was small, almost invisible, but she had noticed it earlier. "Looks like it leads deeper," she said. "Maybe to another opening." He studied it for a moment, then nodded. "Go," he said. "I'll cover you." She crawled toward the crack, pushing through the tight space. The stone scraped against her arms, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Behind her, she heard the soldiers shouting, their voices bouncing off the walls. Then came the sharp sound of a gunshot, followed by another. Her heart leapt. She wanted to turn back, but she forced herself forward. The passage opened suddenly, spilling her into a wider tunnel. She turned and saw a faint light behind her, the Apache emerging, his face pale with pain but alive. "This way," he said, and together they moved deeper into the tunnel. The path sloped downward, and soon they could hear water trickling ahead. They followed the sound until they reached a small underground stream. The light came from above, where the moon shone through a gap in the rocks. He knelt beside the water, dipping his hands in. "They won't find us here tonight," he said quietly. She sank down beside him, her body trembling from exhaustion. "They'll keep looking," she murmured. "They won't stop until they find you." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with something between sorrow and determination. "But then we'll make them find what they fear." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the stream, the water glinting like silver in the moonlight. "My people had a saying," he said finally. "When the wolf is cornered, it doesn't beg. It bites." She realized then what he intended. "You want to fight them?" He nodded once. "Not for revenge. It's for truth. If I die, they'll say I was the savage they claimed. But if I make them face what they did, maybe someone will remember differently." Her heart ached. "You don't have to do this alone." "You have already done enough," he said softly. "Your courage brought me this far, but you must live. For the child. For what comes after." She opened her mouth to protest. But a noise from above stopped her, a faint metallic sound, like a rifle being cocked. She froze. The Apache tensed, his hand going to his knife. The soldiers were above them. Somehow they had found the upper opening of the cavern. Looked at her one last time, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay hidden. No matter what happens." Before she could stop him, he slipped into the shadows near the tunnel mouth, moving like part of the darkness itself. She pressed her back to the wall, gripping the revolver so tightly her knuckles turned white. Moments later, the first soldier dropped into the cavern, landing in a crouch. The light from his torch swung wildly across the walls. Another followed, then another. Their voices echoed harshly as they spread out. "Find him," the captain barked. "Shoot on sight." She watched from the shadows, her pulse hammering. The Apache moved unseen, circling behind them. He was bleeding again, but his steps were silent, his eyes focused. One soldier turned, and in a swift motion, the Apache struck, pulling him into the dark before he could cry out. The other spun around, startled. "What was that? one hissed. The captain lifted his rifle, eyes scanning the darkness. He's here. Keep your torches up. The firelight flickered wildly, throwing strange shapes across the walls. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching longer than the last. She could see the Apache moving behind the rocks, silent and determined. Then one of the soldiers saw movement and fired. The blast echoed through the cave, deafening. Sparks flew as the bullet struck stone. The Apache lunged from behind a pillar, knocking the rifle from the man's hands. They grappled in the dirt, a blur of motion and shadow. The captain raised his gun, aiming toward the fight. She saw it before he did, the muzzle glinting in the firelight. Without thinking, she stepped forward from her hiding place and fired her revolver. The shot rang out, sharp and final. The captain staggered, clutching his shoulder, his face twisting in shock. The soldiers froze, their torches shaking. The Apache turned, eyes wide, seeing her standing there in the open, the revolver still smoking in her hand. "Run!" he shouted. But it was too late. One of the soldiers swung his rifle toward her, and the next instant, the air exploded with another gunshot. She gasped as the sound faded, the world around her tilting into blur. The Apache's voice reached her faintly, calling her name desperate and broken. The firelight flickered wildly across the cavern walls as the river below roared louder, swallowing every sound except the pounding of her heart. And in that moment, with the echoes of gunfire still hanging in the air, the story hung on the edge of its breaking point. The sound of the gunshot lingered in the cave long after the smoke had cleared. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the echo faded into silence. The Apache dropped to his knees beside her, his breath coming in short bursts. Her hand was pressed against her side where the blood was spreading through the fabric, dark and warm. She blinked up at him, her vision flickering between shadow and light. "You're going to be all right," he whispered, though his voice trembled. He tore a strip of cloth from his sleeve and pressed it against her wound. "Stay with me." Her lips curved faintly into a smile, weak but steady. "I told you not to fight alone," she murmured. The soldiers were gone now, scattered or fallen. The captain lay unconscious where he had fallen, and the others had fled into the night after realizing the fight had turned. The cave was silent, except for the sound of water trickling through the rocks. The Apache looked around, his expression hardening. He had survived battles before, but this felt different. This woman, this widow who had risked everything, had done what no one else would. She had given him a reason to live, and now he feared he might lose her. He lifted her gently and carried her out of the cavern. The night air was cool against their faces, and the moon hung high above, pale and steady. The desert stretched out in silver light, quiet and endless. He walked until they reached a patch of soft earth near a cluster of mesquite trees. There he laid her down carefully, his hands shaking. She looked up at the stars, her breathing uneven. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He sat beside her, his dark eyes reflecting the sky. "You should not have come back for me," he said softly. "If you had ridden away, you would have been safe." She turned her head slowly toward him. "Couldn't leave you tied to that tree. Yeah, you didn't deserve to die that way." Her words hung in the air, quiet but full of meaning. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Reached for her hand, his rough fingers closing gently around hers. "You have the spirit of the mountain," he said, "strong and kind." She smiled faintly. "And you have the heart of one who still believes in something good." He stayed beside her through the night, whispering prayers in his native tongue. Prayers for strength, for forgiveness, for life. When dawn came, the light painted the desert in soft gold. She was still alive, but weak. The bleeding had slowed, yet he knew she needed more help than he could give. He looked toward the horizon and made a decision. "I'll find help," he said. "There's a settlement 2 days' walk from here. I'll bring someone back." Her eyes opened, heavy with exhaustion. "You can't leave me here alone." He hesitated, torn between duty and fear. Then he said, "I won't go far. There's a spring nearby. I'll make a shelter first." He gathered branches, dry grass, and stones, building a small shade for her. He brought her water from the spring and covered her with his own blanket. She tried to protest, but he only shook his head. "You need it more," he said. For the next day he stayed close, tending to her wound and keeping watch for danger. When she slept, he sat in silence, thinking about all that had happened, a betrayal by his own people. The cruelty of the soldiers, the moment she had cut him free despite the risk to her own life. It all seemed like a blur of pain and fate woven together by something greater than either of them. That evening, as the sun sank low, she stirred and whispered, "Why were they after you?" He hesitated before answering. "Because I spoke the truth. They made promises to my tribe and broke them. When I tried to warn the others, they called me a traitor. The army used that lie to turn my own against me. They needed someone to blame, and I was easy to find." Her eyes softened with sadness. "Yet you still saved me." He looked at her, his expression calm, but full of quiet strength. "Saving you was saving myself. The moment you cut those ropes, I remembered what it means to trust." For a while, they said nothing. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the faint hum of crickets. The desert, once cruel and empty, now felt almost alive with memory and meaning. The next morning, she awoke to find him gone. Panic rose in her chest until she saw the footprints leading toward the east. He had gone to find help. She tried to rest, clutching the small charm he had left beside her, a piece of carved bone shaped like a feather. Hours passed slowly. The sky burned with heat, then cooled again as the shadows grew long. She drifted between sleep and waking, her thoughts filled with fragments of her past, her husband's death. The quiet grief she carried, the child she still protected. Every choice had led her to this moment, alone in the desert yet strangely at peace. When the sound of footsteps finally reached her ears, she opened her eyes and saw him returning, supported by an older man riding a mule. The stranger was a settler doctor from a nearby camp. The Apache's face was streaked with dust and sweat, but his eyes were steady. The doctor knelt beside her and worked quietly, cleaning the wound and wrapping it with fresh cloth. He spoke little, though his hands were careful. "You're lucky," he said after a while. "Another inch, and it would have been the end." She looked up at the Apache, her voice barely a whisper. "You came back." "I said I would," he replied. Over the next few days, she grew stronger. The doctor left after making sure she could travel, leaving them with supplies in a small wagon. She and the Apache stayed by the spring a little longer, healing not just their bodies, but their hearts. They spoke about the future in quiet tones, what might come next, where they could go where no one would hunt them. When she was finally able to stand, the sun was setting again. The sky burned orange and red, the same colors as the rocks around them. She turned toward him, her eyes thoughtful. "What will you do now?" He looked out over the land. "My people are scattered. Some will never forgive, but some still listen. I'll find them. Tell them what really happened. And me." She asked softly. He met her gaze. "You'll go where you belong. The child needs a home." She smiled faintly. "Maybe the desert is home enough for both of us." He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said more than words ever could. When dawn came again, they stood at the edge of the canyon where it had all begun. The place still carried the marks of battle, the broken stones, the faint smell of gunpowder, but it also felt quiet now, almost sacred. She knelt and placed a small bundle of wildflowers at the spot where her blood had fallen. "This land saw everything," she said softly. "Let it remember the truth." He nodded, standing beside her. "It will." As they turned to leave, the wind rose gently, carrying the scent of rain from far away. The desert seemed to breathe again, alive and forgiving. Days later, when she reached the small town beyond the hills, she looked back one last time. The Apache was already a distant shape against the horizon, moving toward the mountains. She knew their paths might never cross again, yet a part of her heart would always stay with him. Months passed, and the child was born healthy under a clear spring sky. She named him after the word the Apache had used for courage. People in the town whispered about her pastor, about the stranger she had saved, about the night of the fire and the soldiers, but she never spoke of it. She simply lived, quietly and with purpose, raising her son near the edge of the desert. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she thought she could hear drums in the distance, or catch a glimpse of a lone rider watching from the hills. She never feared it. It reminded her that the world was wider than sorrow, that forgiveness could grow even in the harshest places. Years later, when her son was old enough to ask about his father, she told him only that he came from courage and truth, from a night when mercy changed to lives. And as the sun sank beyond the canyon once more, The desert held its silence, sendless, timeless, and full of stories that would never be forgotten.